So now, a little more interesting problem. This is actually going to talk about what's called the break-even point, which if you've had to take any sort of economics, that's like the one part where the math shows up and everybody hates the class that day. This is the math for that day. But you also have to generate the equations. Now, the people who write the book generally were not math comfortable people. So they tried to be like very, very detailed to the point that it's over detailed and can be really frustrating. Or the teacher who is teaching it is not a math person, so explaining can be difficult for them. And it's just a weird kerfuffle. So that's why we try to cover questions like this, but the way we do it is not as realistic as what you would do in economics. So they'll usually show you, here's how to use Excel. So our business example, a storage company rents its units for $120 per month. All right. Has fixed monthly costs of $2,100. All right, they need to rent quite a few to deal with that. And variable costs of air conditioning and service of $50 per unit. So the first one is cost. I want to write just a cost function. And they're using function notation here to reinforce that both of these should be in terms of the same variable, where the variable represents the same thing. So the cost for X units, however many units are being rented per month. So what are the things I have to pay out in cost? Every month, because it does say it is monthly cost, I got to pay out that $2,100, period. Even if I rent nothing, COVID, no one wants to do storage, I still have to pay out $2,100. Oh, yuck. But let's say I've got some loyal customers who all their stuff is being stored. They just don't want to come in and mess with it, so they're just going to pay me. Cool. I get to pay out $50 per unit for each of those to make sure the AC still works. So I don't know how many units though. It could be 2, it could be 20. Whatever it is though, the 50 per unit, and I'm going to write this off to the side. So we have $50 per unit. And then I have X units. Here's that chemistry again. So you see how units on the bottom, units on the top. If I multiply those, they cancel, and I'm left just with money. Over here, my 2,100 is straight money. If I add these two together, it's my total money for cost. So I'm going to do 50 times X and add that to the 2,100, which we could just write as 50X. Part of the reason I don't like this kind of question, though, is it's very hand-wavy. In general, though, what you can think here, let me make some room. I didn't need quite that much, but oh well. So a generic cost function has what are called fixed costs, which is usually just a number, a flat number, which is usually like your rent. If your employees always work a fixed number of hours, your hourly rate that you pay employees. And variable costs. And these are typically some sort of money per thing you sell. So here it is units, but we also use the term unit generically. So it might be how much money you spend per surfboard or per scooter or per pie. Whatever business you want to think of, per pound of jelly beans, per cup of lemonade. You've got those two different kinds. The variable costs, variables in the word, It's going to have the variable be the number of units. Now, realistically, there's a couple variables that would go in there because the number of, like if the number of hours an employee works is fixed, it's in fixed costs. But if you also pay the employee a commission, that's a variable depending on how many things the employee sells, the per unit. And then likewise, usually though, that number for math questions is just subsumed into whatever the number they give you is. In this case, 50 is supposed to include, that's what services here. So there's your kind of, the variable cost is a per unit, and then you end up doing times the number of units, which is typically X. All right, so there's your kind of generic setup for a cost function, at least in math land. Like I said, reality is more complex. Now we need to write revenue. So let's go find it. And again, X is my same units per month. So they are getting 120 per unit per month. So in 1 month, they're going to get 120 per unit. And they didn't tell us any other money coming in, and revenue typically is this straightforward. Whatever our price per unit is, in this case, the 120, times X is the units per month, or just the units. Units would cancel. If we wrote the per month, then it would be money per month, and we would have had it up there as well. But that's by saying monthly cost or the monthly revenue. That's what we're saying. So without the units in there, it would just be R of X equals 120X. So these are two different functions. They represent two different things. One of these, as I make more items, I have to pay out more money. But I have that flat 2,100 that I owe even if I rent nothing. My revenue, every unit that gets rented out, that's another 120 coming in into the cash register. So now we need to figure out the break-even point. And some of you guys might already like gut check be wanting to know, like, what is the number? And maybe you kind of played around with the calculator, like, is it 10? Is it 15? And you can do that actually. You could just guess some numbers, see what happens. We could also graph both of these because they are already, function notation is already solved for y essentially. So we'd have y1 is 2100 plus 50x, y2 is just the 120x. Figure out where they cross. You're probably gonna have to zoom out to actually see the point though. On the calculator, there's zoom fit will actually like stretch things so it works out. All right. But the point where they break even is when I have rented enough units that it equals the cost to rent out those units. Notice the word equal in there. When the revenue equals the cost. So that's what the break-even point means. Which means quite literally, we can set the two things equal to each other and solve. But I've had students kind of logic their way to this. Well, if I'm getting in 120, but I have to pay out 50, that's really effectively 70 bucks in my pocket, like free and clear as it were. So I just got to figure out how many 70s do I need to make to be able to pay off that 2,100. Or how many 70s are in 2,100, which one of the zeros would cancel. 7 goes into 21 3 times with a 0, 30. So if I rent out 30 units, I will have enough money to pay my rent. If I rent more than 30 units, I'm going to be turning a profit. If I rent fewer than 30 units, I will be taking a loss. I will not be making enough to cover the $2,100 and the $50 per unit. Figuring out a way to reduce fixed costs is usually quite difficult because you're looking at, you often can't renegotiate the mortgage on the property. You typically can't. Sometimes you can change like your suppliers, but usually where people tend to cut costs is in their employees. They pay them less or they demand that they produce more for the same amount of money. And when you do that over the course of a century and a half, you get the monstrosity that is the current state of the US. All right, but 30 units. That is how many units we would have to rent in Mathland for our storage company. I am going to put something like this on the take-home part of the final, but it will be a little more involved. So I may even talk about profit. If I wanted to figure out the profit, like think about it. Profit is the money I have after I pay out the stuff I don't want to pay out, but I have to. So that is my money coming in, and then I pay out the stuff I don't want, and my leftover is profit. So the profit function is literally the revenue function minus the cost function. So in this case, that would actually be 120x minus, and then cost is usually more than one term. So safe math, use your parentheses. Sometimes even revenue is. Like maybe you loan somebody some money and they're paying you back every month, then there might be a fixed revenue coming in. All right. So that would be our P of X function. So when R equals C, that's the same as R minus C equaling 0. So the profit is 0 at the break-even point. So that's the other way to figure this out. If you have the profit, set it equal to 0, that's where the revenues balance out the costs. Now, some crazy, like you can set it up so you actually get a profit function that's a curve, like a parabola. And then that break-even point actually happens twice. And then there's a point where you're maximizing your profits. It looks weird though to have that. It can be done. All right, so there's that one. I included one more, some interest, since they brought that back up.